It's been really interesting for us to see how many people want to know more about storytelling. We've had over 220 people sign up to listen to the webinar and a further 80 requesting a recording. So this is obviously a topic close to your hearts. And we've had loads of really interesting questions from you all about why you want to know more about this topic, including how storytelling can be used to inspire change, how it can be used to influence, and also how it can be used to simplify communication and to raise trust. I'm really excited today to be able to introduce you to two speakers who are great, and they're really passionate about storytelling. Russell Cobb, who has joined us as one of our presenters, and Bethany Rivet-Karnak. Before I hand over to them, though, I just wanted to say a few words about their backgrounds. Russell has had 25 years of experience working in people development and commercial and change leadership. Most recently, he was the HR director for Carlsberg, but he's also worked in senior roles at places like Mars and Coca-Cola. He's also an accredited coach, and since a year ago in January, he's established his own coaching and facilitation practice. He was introduced to storytelling as part of leadership development at Coca-Cola and has really used it to great effect during his years there and also since then. Working with him, as I say, is Bethany Rivet-Karnak. Beth has a background in talent acquisition, learning and development, and as a collaboration coach for communities of senior leaders in corporates such as Mars. She loves storytelling, and so much so she's actually been trained with the International School of Storytelling. And Beth has first-hand experience of storytelling in a number of different scenarios. So particularly, and this is the bit that I find really interesting, looking at how storytelling is a catalyst for deeper understanding of our relationship with ourselves and others, and also recognising that the stories we choose to let go of can have as much power as the stories we create. And I think that's a really interesting point of view about that. So that's enough from me. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the questions that come in, and if I know we're going to cover them, I won't interrupt Russell and Beth, but anything we don't cover, I'll ask them at the end. And if you'd like to ask a question, you'll see a box on your screen where you can either send a message publicly or you can send it privately. I'm just going to check that we have got Beth and Russell with us, because I can see that they've had a bit of trouble with their connection. So Beth and Russell, have you been able to reconnect? Okay, so at the moment it looks like their connection has dropped out. So I am sorry for those of you who are waiting here. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about their background whilst we're waiting for them to dial back in. I know that they've had some connection problems this morning.
Can you?
Oh, it sounds like they're back. Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Well, we've gone non-telephone because the telephone threw us out. So if there's a problem with this method, then tell us and we'll try the phone again, okay?
No problem at all. So you may not have heard that I've just been introducing you guys and talking a little bit about your background. So guys, I'm going to hand over to you.
So yeah, as Ruth was saying, I'm very interested in storytelling, and I guess from my point of view, it's first and foremost, it's an interesting title for a conversation, because in my experience, you walk straight up to a senior leader and say, I'd really like to talk to you about storytelling. It takes them to the wrong sort of place, and it takes them to a place that's all about fairy tales, make-believe and fantasy, and that's not what we're thinking of in terms of storytelling in this context. So with my sales head on, so you know, when I used to be a salesman at Mars Confectionery 25 years ago, you know, we used to use the sort of phrases, if we could show you a way to grow your sales of X and Y and Z, would you be interested? And so rather than sort of approaching it head on in terms of want to talk to you about storytelling, the first thing is thinking of it as a way of building engagement, of trust, of willingness, and ultimately action in pursuit of organizational performance. So that's where I'm coming from on the subject. Is the sound working okay, Ruth?
It's sounding great, yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. Now, in organisations, as leaders, we have to make sure that we're communicating effectively in pursuit of that organisational performance. And there's a guy called Kevin Murray who's done a lot of work on leadership and the role of communication. And he says, if you've not communicated well, if people have not heard you, have not understood you, and do not feel motivated to think differently and act differently as a result of your words. So we're aiming to help raise awareness of an approach that can help leaders achieve exactly that. It can be used for any type of any type of communication, whether it's in teams development, whether it's fostering collaboration, communicating business direction, or explaining business issues. But I noticed for those of you listening that an awful lot of you were interested in the context of change, and it is really brilliant for that. I think just on the subject of storytelling, one of the reasons why I personally think it's so brilliant is because it used to be the primary method of communicating. So before people could read, before they could write, stories were used to communicate. So it's part of our evolution. Anything you want to add to that, Beth? So I'll introduce Beth here so she can say hello.
So one of the things I'm probably most passionate about, which storytelling can really help with, is creating a sense of belonging in the associates within your business and enabling them to become a part of the story. So really bridging that gap between the leaders of the organisation and the people who actually create the change that you're looking to implement. So that's probably where my biggest passion comes from.
Thanks, Beth. And why do I think storytelling is effective? I guess many you will have heard of Simon Sinek, and he talks about starting with the why. And my experience in the organisations I've worked in, both as part of the team or lately as a consultant, is leaders are generally so focused on results because it's a tough environment at the moment, whether that's profit or volume or market share or competitor activity, that they tend to spend a lot of time talking about the what they want to happen, and they forget about the why. And if you don't talk about the why, you lose the motivation. So for example, if I said to you or even to Beth, who sat next to me, I want you to be in Paris by lunchtime tomorrow, what's the first thing you say?
I would want to know the reason why.
Yeah. And yet in businesses, we ask people to do a huge range of things, change the way they work really hard, and so on. And we often forget to tell them why. Now in stories have an inherent why, because in the shape of any story, there's some drama, there's some cause, there's some effect. So if we think about using storytelling, then we are inherently thinking about why and making sure we build that into the communication. Now, if I tell you a story from my own experience, this is a bit of a sad story, but it had a good ending in one sense. So Dasani is a Coca-Cola water. It's a purified water. So it doesn't come from a spring. It just comes from from the water. And it is a mineral water, but the minerals are added. Coke is the #2 water in North America, and so Coke thought it'd be great to have that in the UK. So we, as the UK exec, did a load of work on that, and we all got ready to launch, and we launched. And then the media latched onto the fact that we were taking the water from our Sidcup factory in Kent, And for those of you who are Only Fools and Horses fans, Del Boy launched Peckham Springs. So the media started calling Dasani Sidcup Springs. Now, if you believe in the fact that no publicity is bad publicity, that would have been fine, and may well have even helped it get going. 2 weeks later, unfortunately, it was discovered there was a slight discrepancy in the potassium levels. So it met UK regulations, but not European regulations, which were different. And even though it was only a minor over the limits, potassium is a potential carcinogen. So it became very clear very quickly that we had to get Dasani off the shelves. And the normal response at that time would be to say, right, everybody needs to work this weekend. You have to do this, 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 and this. And because we've learned about storytelling as part of our own leadership development, we actually paused for a minute and thought about what was the best way to get the message across. So we explained what had happened and why it was critical to get the product off shelves, basically in the interests of our consumers and our customers. And instead of telling everybody what to do, we asked them to volunteer to work the weekend. And out of 3,000 associates, 85% of them volunteered to work the whole weekend. And by Monday morning, this happened on a Thursday afternoon, by Monday morning, all the stock had come back. So not perhaps the best ending, but nonetheless, it shows the power of storytelling. Any addition from you there, Beth?
Yes. What I really love, I'm very interested in what motivates people within organisations to get on board and do things above and beyond. And I don't know whether some of you may well be familiar with Myers-Briggs, but probably about 50% of the population will be motivated to make decisions based on their personal values. And logic alone doesn't necessarily get them moving in terms of action. And what I love about this story is that it actually, by linking the purpose and the values of the organisation in terms of customer care, and being able to invite people within the organisation to fulfil that value in them, this story meant that people were really motivated to act. And you're really tapping into the values of the people who work within your business when you're telling the full story.
Brilliant. Thanks, Beth. Great. Okay, so Steve Jobs, is a contemporary leader who used storytelling to great effect. If you've looked at any of his YouTube speeches, and Winston Churchill is a personal favourite of mine. And I guess the purpose of our conversation today is to help you think about how you might use this skill to develop your leadership. Now, if we start to get a bit practical, if you look at the facts sheet that Emma will have sent to yours, you'll see there's 4 references to storytelling, all HBR articles, which I found very useful. But I guess my favourite is from Peter Guber. So if you do want more, you know where to find it. But I'm going to highlight Peter Guber. It's very like the way the fact sheet writes how to tell compelling stories. So being honest, tailoring to the audience, be relevant, and believe in a goal. Now, the way he describes it is you have to be true to yourself first and foremost. So truth to the teller. We only use about 90% of our brain consciously at any one time, but the other 90% is working away unconsciously, and it's very, very smart at spotting when somebody is not essentially telling the truth. So to be a great storyteller, you have to be honest and you have to believe your own story. Otherwise, people will spot that. And if you are true to yourself and you are open and you share your feelings, Then you build trust, and trust is the first thing that we talked about in terms of getting the engagement and the willingness and ultimately the action. So first thing, be true to yourself, believe your own story. Second thing, who are you talking to? Put yourself in their shoes. Think about what they want to hear. What do they need to hear? And another thing that leaders very often do, and I know because I've done it myself, you spend a disproportionate amount of time preparing communication to influence the stakeholders and decision makers on whatever it is you want to do. You know, so for you guys, if you're trying to create a new leadership development program, you'll put a whole load of time and effort into persuading the HR director, the other business leaders that that's the right thing to do. That's one audience. When you then go out and talk to the delegates, it's really tempting to just use the same story, but actually they need to hear a different story. So there's something about really putting yourself in the shoes of the people you're talking to, and also using time wisely. So I know I've struggled over the years sitting for hours in conference rooms. So just think sometimes less is more, and it's quality, not quantity. Truth to the moment, again, a little bit to the same point about how things have moved on. Times change from the point when you actually create a story, and think about how you are adapting it and updating it and learning from how you told it previously in order to maximize the impact. And then finally, there's the mission. What do you actually want to happen? And is the whole story lined up to deliver that? If I go back to my favourite Winston Churchill if I looked at one of his speeches using this as a sort of template, and it was amazing how it just dropped into this. So I'm sure you'll recognise these quotes. So if I think about Churchill being true as the teller, he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." So he's absolutely being honest, he's sharing his feelings, and he's being very humble. If you then go on to audience, he immediately then switches into the we. We are in the preliminary stage of one of the greatest battles in history. We are in action at many points. So he's instantly not making it about him and you, he's making it about us. And then if you go to the moment, he says, "We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering." So he's being honest, he's being true. That was the reality when he made this speech. And finally, and this is the bit that fits probably the best, through to the mission, he then says, "You ask, what is our aim? Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival." So for me, that's a really powerful example of something long before Peter Guber was even born, actually using this as a structure for one of his speeches. Beth, anything from you?
Yeah, I think you've illustrated the four truths really beautifully through that example.
Right, so what we're going to do now is have a look at somebody telling a story. It's the President of North America, Obama. This is a story from early in his presidency, and obviously all the stories on the media at the moment are all about the end of his presidency, which is coming up, and an interesting range of choices about who's going to replace him. But what I would like you to do is watch this. This is him talking to a group of students about healthcare reform. So watch this and look for how he's true to himself, how he's true to the people in the room, how he's true to the moment, and how he's true to his mission. And then we'll come back and review it for you.
Some of you remember during the campaign, we had a slogan, fired up. There we go. Not everybody here knows how this story came about. So I'm going to tell it again. Because it bears on healthcare reform. This is early in the campaign when none of you knew how to pronounce my name. I had just announced and I was looking for support. I had to go down to South Carolina. That was an early primary state. I went down to Greenville for a legislative dinner. And I was sitting next to a state representative there, and I wanted her support. I needed some endorsements. Nobody supported me at the time. So I said, Madam Representative, I need your endorsement. She said, I will give you my endorsement if you come to my hometown, Greenwood, South Carolina. And I said, I had had a glass of wine. I said, fine. I'm coming. Come to find out that Greenwood is an hour and a half from every place else. It's in the middle of nowhere. So about a month later, I fly back into Greenville. I'm tired. I'm sleepy. I've been campaigning for 2 weeks straight. I'm dragging my bags to my hotel room, and suddenly I get a tap on my shoulder. It's my staff person. I said, what? They said, we got to be in the car at 6:30 tomorrow morning. I said, what? 6:30, why? Because we've got to go to Greenwood like you promised. So the next morning, I wake up and I feel terrible. Dragging out of bed. Feel like a college student. Feel like I'm back in college and don't want to wake up. Feel like I've been staying up late doing who knows what. I remember how y'all are. So I just feel I'm exhausted. I go over to the curtains to try to get some sunlight, wake myself up. It's pouring down rain outside. Miserable day. I go to get some coffee, I'll open up the newspaper. There's a bad story about me in the New York Times. I go downstairs, and my umbrella busts open, and I get poured on. So by the time I'm in the car, I'm wet, and I'm sleepy, and I'm tired, and I'm mad. And we start driving, and we're driving, and it's an hour and a half, and I realize I'm going to have to drive an hour and a half back. And finally we get to Greenwood, although you don't know you're in Greenwood right away. But there's a little park district building. We go into this park field house. I get a little more wet. Get inside, and after this long drive, waking up at 6:30, there are only about 20 people. 20 people. And they're all kind of damp, and they don't look that excited to see me. They don't really know how to pronounce my name either. But, I'm running for president, so I'm shaking hands. How do you do? Nice to meet you. Suddenly, I hear this voice behind me shout out, fired up! And I'm startled. But everybody around me, they just think this is normal. They say, fired up. And suddenly, I hear this voice, ready to go! And everybody goes, ready to go. I said, what's going on? I look behind me, there's this small woman. She's about 5 feet, 5'2". She's about 50, 60 years old, and she's dressed like she just came from church. She's got a big church hat, and she's looking at me. She's smiling. She says, "Fired up!" Come to find out that there's a city council member from Greenwood. She also, by the way, moonlights as a private detective. True story. True story. But she's mainly known for her chant. She does this everywhere she goes. Everywhere at any event, football game, at a city council meeting, she says, fired up. And everybody says, fired up, I'm ready to go. Everybody says, ready to go. So for the next 5 minutes, she keeps on doing this. She says, fired up, ready to go, ready to go. And I realize I'm being upstaged by this woman. So I'm looking at my staff asking, you know, what's going on here? When is this going to stop? And they're shrugging their shoulders. They don't know. But here's the thing, Marilyn. After about a couple minutes of this, suddenly I realized I'm feeling kind of fired up. I'm feeling like I'm ready to go. So I start joining in the chant. And for the rest of the day, wherever we went, whenever I saw my staff, I said, "Are you fired up?" They say, "I'm fired up, boss." "Are you ready to go?" They say, "I'm ready to go." So it goes to show you, and this is so important for young people, it goes to show you one voice can change a room. And if a voice can change a room, it can change a city. And if it can change a city, it can change a state. It can change a state, it can change a nation. If it can change a nation, it can change the world. We will change the world with your voice. We need the voices of young people to transform this nation, to meet up to the meaning of its creed. I need your voice. So I want to know, are you fired up? Ready to go? Fired up? Ready to go? Fired up? Ready to go? Let's go change the world. Thank you, everybody.
Slight technical issue here in that we don't seem to have a picture. Oh no, come back. Sorry. Plenty of technical issues today. Okay, so Beth, how did that make you feel?
I felt pretty fired up and ready to go after watching that. And what I absolutely love that Obama did there is he talked the full range of human emotions in that talk, from how mad he was to how his energy and his emotion changed. He talked feelings, which, from my perspective, I'm a big fan of Brené Brown, and she says, we are ultimately feeling beings who think. But from my experience, so often actually we forget to talk feelings. And what he does do is authentically share not just the good feelings, but where he felt mad, you know, where he felt he wasn't fired up. And for me, that built a connection between me and him. He's human just like I am, and resonated really well with me.
Great, thanks, Beth. And I think, you know, if all of you looked at the truth to the teller, the audience, the moment and the mission, very, very clear, the structure there. And what you'll also notice, and I'm sure loads of you will know this, that it's not what he said, it's an awful lot about how he said it. And I know in corporates, from my own experience, we spend most of the time when we think about communication in terms of what are the words we're going to use, what does the PowerPoint look like, and we devote less energy to, you know, how we're going to say it, how we're going to be in that moment. And actually all that time and energy on wordsmithing, PowerPointing, you know, if you listen to that, it doesn't matter. So again, if we're getting increasingly practical now with time, so, you know, there's a whole different set of words and analysis on what makes a story, but broadly speaking, this is a summary of various different analysis of it. First and foremost, any story, you need to introduce the players, the context, the world in which we're operating. And then typically something happens that to disturb that context, and that triggers only a trigger because of the heart of the story is there'll be some amazing opportunity to win a gold medal, or some huge disaster like an asteroid heading towards the planet that creates the consequences, the benefits And going back to Simon Sinek, the heart gives you the why. And then, because nothing worth having is easy, in any story there needs to be, a play between wanting to achieve it and it looking likely, versus actually it's really difficult. So our expectation of, even in corporate life, of things like implementing IT systems, you'd like it to be really straightforward. The reality is it often isn't. And finally, whether you're telling the story after the event or you're using the story to talk about a change that's coming, you need to be talking about how is the happy ending going to happen. And so, I mean, I've used this structure in things like SAP implementation, where you talk about all the learning, you talk about all the employee involvement, because you're wanting people to engage with it and have the conversations, and that those will deliver a resolution for everybody you're talking to. So that's the practical structure. Now, I was going to play you this speech from Al Pacino, which I'm not, in the interests of time, because I want to make sure that we get some questions from you and we can answer them. But I recommend it to you, provided you're not averse to swearing. Okay, so there are a few swear words in it, but again, when you look at that, and it's on YouTube, just listen for, he uses all the truths, he uses what Morabian says, and actually, if you think about that structure of a story we've just been through, it's right there in that 4-minute speech. Now, when do you tell your stories? This is some work from a guy I've known for about 15 years called Chris Rogers, who started out as a power station engineer. So he comes from a very gritty background, and he realised that actually communication often was ineffective. And so his analysis, after a whole load of work, was that leaders tend to rely upon the organised and structured end of the spectrum. So they send messages with PowerPoint slides, and they might have some meetings, some team meetings, and some workshops to start to make sense of whatever that story or message has been sent. The issue with relying upon those two is engagement with the audience. So how do you know, what have they understood? How have you understood whether they're motivated by it? And how have you understood whether they even feel capable of what they're being asked to do? And you know what it's like when somebody asks you, can we have any questions, please? And you're thinking, well, I can't ask a question about that, or I can't say that. And however great an organisation you are, there's a fear from people that they're going to be judged and that they can't take the risk in those environments. Leaders typically tend to underplay the spontaneous and unstructured. And the key part of that for me is the everyday conversation. When you're bumping into people, how do you ask them, what they actually thought of what they heard, and do it in a way that's safe for them to say what they really believe and what they really think. And probably in inviting that and demonstrating that they're safe to take the risk, you need to show something of yourself. And the other key component that he talks about is role modeling. So if you've told a story, back to truth to the teller, it doesn't have to be just true for you at the point you're telling it for the first time. It has to be true all the time after that, because as soon as somebody spots you not being true to what you said, then you've broken the motivation and the why. So that's a useful tool I share with you for that. Where does the trust come from? It comes from the fact that we as people will only share our beliefs and attitudes and feelings if we actually trust. If there's too much risk and not enough trust, we'll stick to facts and we'll stick to saying what we think the boss wants to hear, for example. So Beth, I know trust is a big thing for you. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. So I heard a statistic recently that shocked me, which is that 61% of people in organisations actually mask at work. You know, they don't show up as their full whole self, feelings, beliefs, etc. And for me, that means leaders in organisations, if they're not actually exhibiting that behaviour of sharing their feelings, the likelihood is your people aren't going to be sharing theirs back. And it has to start from somewhere. So for me, it's so important to create the kind of environment where people feel comfortable to take those masks off, because otherwise you're only really hearing half of the story.
And I think in particularly in organisational change, which I know is very important to you, some means of really finding out what people understand, what they think, how they're feeling, is one of the great barriers to change, because we want to, going back to the what, we want to get on, we want to make it happen, we want to deliver it. And there's a risk, and I know because I'm a very rational, logical person, that this is all viewed as a little bit fluffy and a little bit tree huggish. But in reality, it works, and I would, I guess, challenge you to experiment with it, try it, and see what reactions you get when you share a little bit more of yourself than you normally do. So trust is key. But again, back to practicality, you know, the Obama speech, that absolutely was not off the cuff. And I know he's got probably a few resources to help him, but he didn't deliver that great performance just by rocking up and doing it. He wasn't reading off a script. And in order to be able to do that and do it well and do it authentically, you need to plan. And so this is the kind of template that I use in terms of, okay, so what is my core message? What do I need to say? What do I want people to remember? What do I want them to do? And just remembering that structure, you know, this is how we've been at wherever you are, you know, meeting our hero, there's some adversity, there's an action plan, and don't forget that prospect of a happy ending. And it's very easy to have a generic message, but then back to the tailoring to the moment and to the audience. Who are you talking to? How do you put yourself in their shoes, and how do you want them to feel? And finally, you know, think about telling it. You know, how and when will you do it? How will you make it short, simple, engaging? What level of preparation are you going to put into it? Back to that thing about the slides may look brilliant. There may not be a word out of place. Is that going to inspire and engage people in pursuit of change, in pursuit of organisational performance? And I don't believe it will. So there's a practical tool to help. And Beth is saying she'd like to say something.
I just wanted to add one thing here when it comes to how you tell it. I think what often can be quite challenging is when we've prepared and put our heart and soul into a depth that we really believe in, actually, when we're telling the story, what we've got to be mindful of is actually watching the energy in the room and responding in the moment to that energy. And if you're noticing as a storyteller that your audience are fidgeting, their eyes look glazed, then clearly you're not engaging them. And so for storytellers, what's so important is understanding how to shift their energy in order to shift the energy in the room, and playing with that and being conscious of that in the moment, which is an art.
And if you do go look at the Al Pacino speech, you will notice he starts really, really quietly and builds energy. And the Obama did that as well. So yeah, energy is absolutely key, as Beth says. So there we are. You know, our aim was to show you a way of building engagement, thinking about trust, getting some openness to change particularly, but ultimately, you know, action is where it comes from. So for me, you know, this is a quote from one of the other articles. You know, we are in a tough world. at the moment from a business point of view in many organisations. Survival isn't going to happen from PowerPoint slides, Excel spreadsheets. It's going to come from leaders inspiring people to do something different. And they need to understand it. They need to feel motivated, back to the why. And at the end of the day, my brain's just gone completely empty. They need to feel capable. They need to feel capable of doing what you're asking them to do. So thank you very much for listening. Beth, anything you'd add in summary? Why are you such a fan?
Yes. So for me, I've had obviously a background in talent acquisition, and I know firsthand how difficult it is to inspire people to join your organisation in the first place. And more research is suggesting now that the younger generations who are going to be the future of your businesses, for them, purpose is key. The why an organisation does what it does is what is drawing them to some businesses and not others. So for me, this is a great opportunity to start responding to this desire for more purpose in organisations and to start practicing bringing more of that purpose and that whole human approach into the workplace. And there's a lot of evidence that I've been reading up on recently that suggests that purpose-led organisations actually in the long term are more profitable. So it is logical too.
Brilliant. Thanks, Beth. Back to you, Ruth, because I gather we'll have a few questions that have come in the chat room. So thanks very much for listening, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks, Russell and Beth. There are a few questions actually, and so I've got some that have come in by email and some that have come in the question box that you may have seen. So one question: how can you create positive, energizing stories when you're in the middle of kind of restructuring and redundancy? So basically, in the middle of something pretty negative.
Well, I mean, and I think my experience of that is that leaders don't like talking about the negative bits. And the first thing is that if you go back to the structure, that is the adversity, and I think being honest and acknowledging it is absolutely the first thing, and then actually letting people know through stories that it's okay for them to share the fact that it's that they're frightened of the consequences of the change, and actually harness their power into it. So I think, a bit like my Dasani story, not every story is inherently a happy story, but it can still be inspirational.
Yeah, I think what's important for me there as well is inviting a two-way conversation and enabling those people who are experiencing redundancies to actually share their stories too. Because I think often it can be very easy for it to be a one-way conversation, and we forget to actually allow other people affected to feel heard. And from my experience, communication processes, being heard goes a long way to helping people feel more positive.
So it sounds as though you're both advocating that kind of real honesty again, going back to that Peter Guber's 4 truths, that being honest, facing up to the reality of the situation, being willing to kind of share your own emotions, but also asking other people to share how they're feeling and what their story is.
One of the times I've used this was I had to personally do all the consultation at Carlsberg on closing their final salary pension scheme to future accrual. And I suppose the happy ending in that was essentially that by not making the pension fund any longer, they had a much greater chance of actually getting all the benefits that they'd already accrued. So, for example, that was not great news, but you could still use the approach in terms of helping people understand why and why are they gonna benefit.
We've got a related question here actually, which is around how can you start using stories in the middle of change when perhaps you've not been honest so far? So essentially looking to win back employee engagement and trust, which perhaps has been lost. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one, because, back to whatever you've said, people, will remember that. I was telling Beth earlier, my last role at Coke was VP HR for European Supply Chain. And I stood at my first conference and said, I will visit every location in the next 12 months. And I visited all locations bar one. And about 2 years later, somebody walked up to me from that location and said, oh, you haven't been to ours yet. So people will remember. Now, back to honesty is, and to Beth's point about asking people what they're thinking and feeling, because the chances are organizations, people in organizations actually know the truth anyway, and there is a power in acknowledging it, even if it is a little bit late.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
When you can actually admit you've made a mistake as well, you're helping other people break down the barriers of perfectionism, stifling for creativity in organisations, because people feel it's not okay to make a mistake. And so I think if leaders are willing to hold their hand up and say, do you know what, we do all make mistakes, then you could be encouraging your people to take greater risks and be more creative. So there could be a happy ending to
that. Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question here, which is around research. So are you aware of any research which shows how effective storytelling is?
In the HBR articles, they talk about, the research that they've done in terms of the power of it. The only thing I can think of very specifically is it does come through in employee engagement surveys as well. So, if you talk to key engagement survey providers, the likes of Towers Watson or Gallup or people like that, they will very often have a number of measures around communication, around trust, around openness and honesty, and as Beth said, around making mistakes. And they will say that the more open and honest communication, of which storytelling is a part, drives higher employee engagement.
In addition to that, I mentioned earlier, I guess with storytelling, you're ultimately sharing the purpose behind things. Alex Edmonds, who I watched at a TED event at London Business School, and he did a lot of research. His background is now research, looking at the impact of being a purpose-led organisation and the impact of employee well-being, to then the profits that then come from that. I recommend Googling EDMANS, London Business School, for his talk, because he has some really great research behind him as well, which will help people talk about, an increase in purpose in all and the positive impact that can have.
Beth, you cut out slightly with his name there, so could you just say the name again?
Typical, isn't it? Just that moment. Alex Edmonds, it's ED, M for mother, A, M for November, S. And actually, okay. His TED talk is told in storytelling style as well, so he illustrates it beautifully.
Brilliant. So we'll perhaps get the details of that and send that out to everybody, so that you've got that to have a look at if you'd like to. We've had another question that's come in around project leading across cross-functional teams who've got competing priorities. So is it possible to use storytelling to really inspire them to deliver on your project?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think where there's multiple teams is about how you tailor the story. So the core of the story may well be the same, but if there's multiple teams who are doing slightly different things in slightly different locations, then it would be tailoring it for the particular audience and the particular moment that you're telling that story. But yeah, I mean, I think really powerful people just do it in conversation.
Yeah. Okay. And actually, one of those questions that came up related to that was, when's a good time to use one-way conversation compared to two-way? And my feeling is you guys are encouraging as much as possible the two-way conversation. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do, because back to that Chris Rogers model, if you as a leader are not participating in the two-way conversation, you think everything's fine and that conversation's not happening, but it is. So, you know, you can choose to be a part of the conversation in that I don't understand, I don't care, I don't feel able to. But if you don't participate, it's still going to happen. So get involved in two-way conversation. Exactly right, Ruth.
Brilliant, thank you. And then, go on, sorry, Beth.
Let's face it, you know, regardless of where we are, we all use two-way communication in our everyday lives. You know, I wouldn't be able to motivate my husband to load the dishwasher if I didn't talk to him, two-way conversation, and listen to his response. I just think, you know, it's the same in business as outside. It's just human nature to talk and to listen.
I'm shocked that you want to get stereotyping there,
One of the question then, guys, around the sort of sourcing of stories. Obviously, we've seen one story with Obama and another one that you've pointed people towards with Al Pacino that are out there to look at on TED Talks, on YouTube. Do you think it's more effective to use personally written stories which mean something to you as an individual, rather than kind of looking out there for what might exist already?
I use those because they are great examples of it in action that help people get the point. I mean, what I do when I run this as a workshop is then get people working on their own stories and then practice telling them. So, you know, you go off and prep and something real. I'm not into role playing, so something real that will help you achieve something in business context. Create a story, practice telling it, get feedback, adapt it. So absolutely, yes. You know, it doesn't have to have an Obama or an Al Pacino in it.
One of the things I found really useful in my last role actually at Mars, I was a collaboration coach, encouraging senior leaders to see the value in being vulnerable, and also to share their knowledge rather than feel that they have to take ownership of their knowledge themselves. Quite a sensitive subject, and I found actually through using analogies and stories that were quite open, and I actually used a lot of analogies of redwood trees and how nature actually responds, because it was something that people could relate to in their own way. And it was actually slightly less personal, which in that instance worked really, really well. And it meant that when I was delivering my story, it wasn't seen as me finger pointing, that they weren't doing something that they were meant to be doing. So I think it's a case of choosing what's relevant to the audience.
And Beth, I know that when we've spoken about this, you've also talked about being the storyteller, being really clear of the kind of the internal map that they have of the story, and knowing it really well to create that trust as well with the audience that you're going to bring them back home again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the key themes at the International School of Storytelling is that when you're actually inviting people to come into that realm of their imagination and join you on that story, they can very easily, as Russell said earlier, tell if you're not being completely authentically true. And if somebody feels that they're not in capable hands, they're going to be either really reluctant to go on that journey with you into their imagination, or halfway through that story, they're potentially going to be fearful of where you're going, and they really have to trust that you can get them home. So actually being able to visualize where that story took place. And if you are using a story that's not your own, actually mapping that out, what is the landscape and what would people be seeing and feeling and smelling and hearing at different parts of that story is really invaluable.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious that we're just up at midday, so I think what we'll do is probably close the webinar there, and if anyone does have any other questions that they'd like us to answer, please by all means do send them to us on an email and we'll make sure we come back to you. But Russell and Beth, from my point of view, thank you so much for being willing to share your wisdom and insights around this topic. As I said at the beginning, this is clearly something that people are really interested in. Because of the very big response we've had to the number of people wanting to come and listen. Thank you also to all of the contributors in the conversations we've been going through. There have been some great comments coming through there, so really appreciate that. Russell, Beth, anything that you'd like to say before we sign off?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll look forward to you joining us on another webinar soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.